Both the Book of Acts and Josephus mention a revolutionary leader who is referred to as the Egyptian. Josephus tells us that he led a large following to the Mount of Olives, but was defeated by Roman troops. However, the Egyptian himself escaped, never to be heard from again. Or was he? There may be hints in the Book of Acts that identify the Apostle Paul as the Egyptian. This may come as a shock to some, since Acts chapter 21 explicitly denies that Paul was the Egyptian. So how can that be? Let's first take a look at what Josephus says. Josephus was an ancient Jewish historian, but also a Roman propagandist. He refers to the Egyptian in Antiquities of the Jews in the Jewish War. He describes him as a false prophet who gathered thousands of followers on the Mount of Olives, promising that the walls of Jerusalem would fall, allowing his followers to enter the city. However, the Roman governor Felix intercepted the group, resulting in the deaths and capture of many, while the Egyptian leader himself managed to escape. In Acts 21 verse 38, the Apostle Paul is mistaken for the Egyptian. According to this account, the Egyptian had led a large group of people into the wilderness, intending to overthrow Roman rule in Jerusalem. These accounts align, but have some differences in the details, such as the size of the following and specific events. The important question to ask here is, why does the author of Acts feel the need to deny that Paul was the Egyptian? We can infer that at least some people thought that he was the Egyptian, otherwise there would be no need to make the denial. There is an argument here between the biblical author and the original reader. Is the book of Acts propaganda trying to create an alternative story that explains why Paul had to go to the emperor, or is the original reader the victim of unsubstantiated gossip that Paul was the Egyptian? To resolve this, we need to ask which side makes more sense. The argument revolves primarily around three questions. Why did Paul appeal to Caesar? Where was Paul from? And did people think he was a murderer? Let's start with why did Paul appeal to Caesar. Paul's appeal to the emperor, described in Acts 25 through 26, was a significant moment in his journey. After being arrested in Jerusalem due to conflicts with Jewish authorities over his teachings, Paul was transferred to Caesarea, where he stood trial before the Roman governor Festus. As a Roman citizen, Paul had the legal right to appeal his case directly to the emperor, a privilege that could override local jurisdiction. He used this right, stating, "I appeal to Caesar." This appeal meant his case would be transferred to Rome, allowing him to defend himself at the highest level. Festus agreed, saying, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." At least, that's what the biblical author would have you believe. Not every case could appeal to Caesar, even if one was a Roman citizen. There were generally three types of cases that could be appealed to Caesar in ancient Roman times. Capital cases. These involved serious crimes like murder or treason, where the punishment could be death. If a Roman citizen was sentenced to death, they had the right to appeal directly to Caesar. Citizenship rights. Roman citizens could appeal cases related to their rights and privileges under Roman law. For instance, if a Roman citizen felt that they were wrongly punished or denied certain rights, they could appeal to Caesar to ensure their citizenship rights were protected. High-profile disputes. Some cases involved political, legal, or social disputes that had broader implications, such as land ownership or tax issues, especially if local authorities could not resolve them. In cases like these, individuals could seek Caesar's judgment, appealing to his authority to settle conflicts involving substantial legal or social impact. Although one could make the argument that Paul appeals to Caesar due to concerns of fairness with the local jurisdiction, that doesn't seem to be the reason why Paul makes the appeal. Paul is concerned because it's a capital case, as he states in Acts 25 verse 11. If Paul was the Egyptian, then murder or treason as the cause of the appeal makes sense here. And if the account of the book of Acts is propaganda, the biblical author had a difficult task. He wants to legitimize Paul's appeal to Caesar, but doesn't want to associate him with murder or treason. The solution was to keep the charges vague and never charge Paul with murder or treason specifically. In fact, Acts stresses just the opposite. But it's Paul himself that makes it into a capital case. Let's take a look at Paul's appeal in Acts. Acts 25 verses 7 through 10 says, "After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove." Notice here that the charges are vague, never mentioning murder or treason. While Paul said in his own defense, "I have not done anything wrong either against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges?" Notice that it's Felix wanting to do the Jews a favor more than what Paul is actually charged with. But Paul said, "I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know." The author of Acts continually emphasizes that Paul is innocent. But notice here the author of Acts' dilemma. He wants the charges to be from the Jews and not from the Romans. But if it was from the Jews, then he would have had no need to be in Caesarea before Caesar's tribunal. And so the author of Acts comes up with a convoluted story, making the charges coming from the Jews, but standing before Caesar's tribunal. The next question we have to answer is, where is Paul from? The book of Acts tells us that he's from Tarsus. In fact, it tells us 4 times, 2 of them in the context of his arrest. In ancient propaganda, emphasis was a way to try to change the narrative. We've seen this already in the emphasis in Acts that Paul was innocent. Perhaps Acts emphasizes that Paul was from Tarsus in order to change it from Egypt, which, by the way, wouldn't necessarily mean that Paul was Egyptian in ethnicity, but only that he was from there. Finally, we have to answer if people during that time thought he was a murderer. We may have a hint of this in Acts 28, where it says in reference to Paul, "Undoubtedly this man was a murderer." In ancient propaganda, authors would take sayings and then place them into a new context to change the meaning. If people initially believed Paul to be a murderer because they thought he was the Egyptian, then the author of Acts would have needed to reshape that perception. This is achieved by having Paul survive both a shipwreck and a viper's bite, with the latter reinforcing his innocence through a miraculous survival. This story may also hint at how Paul died as well, but that's a topic for another video. If you like this video on Paul, you might also enjoy my series on 1 Thessalonians, where I reconstruct the situation in Thessalonica and the teachings of Paul's opponents. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.